of kindness, generosity, and so forth arising from religious commitment. And trying to get this balance right seems to me to be of enormous importance. What is the fringe? What is the center? So that's one point I think I'd like to open up for further discussion. But I'd also like to try and just make a more general point, and that is that I think worldviews in general, whether they are religious, irreligious, whatever they are, have the capacity to animate people to the extent that they feel they must go and do things which many of us would regard as morally reprehensible. We see this in the Soviet Union, a rather grim period in modern history, where we find, for example, Lenin having said basically that there is no higher authority by which he may be judged, feeling able to, I quote, authorize the protracted use of brutality against religious believers. And it seems to me that we have here an ideology, a worldview, which basically is sanctioning violence, in this case, anti-religious violence. Now, I would not argue from that this shows that atheism in general, or atheists in particular, are violent people. It's much more about what movements do to people, about the damage that worldviews can cause when they begin to take over and begin to really animate people to want to do things. Again, look at the period under Stalin. There are many other examples we could give of worldviews that may well have begun with great excitement, great enthusiasm, a commitment to ideals that we can all identify with, but something happens and they go wrong. The French Revolution, I believe, began with an outburst of energy for liberty. But by 1793, it degenerated into the reign of terror, in which an appeal to liberty sanctioned the most dreadful acts of violence. And many of you will know the tragic story of Madame Roland, who was brought to the guillotine on trumped-up charges in 1793, and as she was led to the guillotine, she pointed to a statue of liberty in the Place de la Révolution and said, "Liberty, what crimes are committed in your name?" History, I think, discloses a complex judgment here. I do not believe that it simply points to religion as being the cause of evil. I think it points to the capacity of all worldviews to begin to do this. It's not so much religion or indeed anti-religion. It seems to be something actually about human nature itself, which means that acts of kindness can be accompanied by acts of violence. There's something about us, I think, that really needs to be addressed there. So I don't think it's as straightforward as this. Religion poisons everything? I'm not sure. It can do, but so can other things as well. The real problem, I think, is extremism, the kinds of ideologies that force violence upon us. And those, it seems to me, do need to be challenged. And on that, I am at one with Mr. Hitchens. But is it God that's doing this? Well, let's move on and talk about this. Clearly, a very important question here is how we know what God is like. Can you imagine God saying, "Go and do violence to someone"? Well, I think some could quite easily. But I speak from a specific perspective, namely that of a Christian theologian. And for Christianity, the identity, the nature of God is disclosed in Jesus of Nazareth. He is the image of the invisible God. He is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. And when we look at Jesus of Nazareth, we see something, I think, that is very, very challenging. We have one who refuses to do violence. Even in Gethsemane, when some want to raise swords to defend him as he's about to be betrayed, he bids them put their swords down. Jesus does not do violence, but he has violence done to him. And the point I want to make is that your vision of what God is like has a profound impact on what you think God is urging you to do. And it seems to me that if one is a good Christian, then one is going to take the vision of what God is like and what God wants us to do that we find disclosed in Jesus with the utmost seriousness. Now, let me make it absolutely clear. I concede, and I may well be one of these, that there are many bad Christians around who fail to live up to this vision. But I want to draw a clear distinction between some Christians are bad and Christianity is bad. There is an aspiration, an inspiration, and norm, and that means one can challenge those who want in some way to use violence in the name of God. And of course, you can see this impacting on the way in which people behave in an episode that happened a year ago here in the United States. You've had, unfortunately, in recent days, some shooting incidents. And of course, what I'm talking about is the Amish schoolhouse killings of October 2006. And many of you will know of these. Some of you may have been affected by them. A crazed gunman broke into an Amish schoolhouse and shot, I think it was 10 Amish schoolgirls, of whom 5 died. The Amish, as I'm sure you all know, are a very conservative Protestant sect who wear 17th century clothing, who won't drive cars, they use horse buggies, and they also regard the ethical example of Jesus as absolutely normative. For them, there will be no retribution of any kind. The cycle of violence was broken instantly because for them, Christ ordered them, commanded them to show forgiveness. That's a very important point. Religion, or at least in this case Christianity, contains within itself the capacity for self-criticism. This is not the way God is. This is not the way we should be behaving. And I fully concede there are those who fail to live up to that. But there is a challenge that can be issued to them. Why behave like this when there is the norm before you, authorized as what God would like us to do? So it seems to me there is a very important point to make there. Now, Mr. Hitchens made some very interesting points about the relationship of science and faith. And of course, for me, who was studying science at Oxford, doing research in molecular biophysics, these were live questions. And I certainly welcome his challenge to discuss these things further. But for me, there has never been this opposition between science and faith. Certainly, some say there is, but I would want to make this point, building on what Stephen Jay Gould says. Gould, in his book, Rocks of Ages, makes the point, I think fairly, that although in his case he's an atheist, he was not an atheist on account of his science. That in many ways his atheism was already there. He brought it to his science. And he makes this point, that science, by its legitimate methods, cannot adjudicate the God question. Certainly, we can read nature in an atheist way, we can read nature in an agnostic way, we can read nature in a Christian way, but nature in itself and of itself does not force us to any of those positions. And I will simply say that I find my Christian faith gave me new intellectual energy, both to engage the natural order. To engage nature is to learn more about God, and also to energize my understanding of what I was observing. And I find this summed up in a quote from C.S. Lewis, which I am in the habit of quoting, I'm afraid. I believe, he writes, in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not simply because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. In other words, it gives you an intellectual lens or framework through which you can look at the world, ourselves, culture, and see it in a new light. So for me, science and religion, there may be tensions, but there's also a very powerful synergy, which I believe to be both welcome and also something that can be developed further. But let me move on, if I may, and make a further point. Mr. Hitchens makes some very significant criticisms of religion, which I emphasize need to be taken seriously. But what I wonder, does he offer in its place? In his book, he talks a bit, especially at the beginning and the end, of the need for a new enlightenment. And I find this puzzling, though nevertheless extremely interesting. I find it puzzling